Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar On-Demand Mobility Service Design, Making Fleets 10 Times More Efficient. Thank you for joining us. I'm Bill Peatman from Bestmile, person who has been emailing you and sending you reminders for this event, and happy that you are all here. Today, we will explore how to simulate on-demand mobility services in advance of deployment and how to define and control service efficiency. Just to go through some logistics, the webinar will be about 20 minutes of content followed by a Q&A session. You can ask questions using the Q&A feature available at the bottom of your screen by submitting written questions, and then we will, during the course of the webinar, sort the most frequently asked questions and make sure we get to the most important ones at the end. The webinar is being recorded. So you will each receive a link to a recorded version, and all registered attendees that were not able to attend in person will also receive a link to the recording. You are muted, and again, can ask questions at the bottom by pressing the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. One word as well, when you leave the webinar, you will receive an email from Zoom, our webinar platform, with a link to a survey. And we'd love to have you complete the survey and let us know what you thought about the content and how we can improve webinars and other events in the future. And now about our presenters. Today are Luc Texier, Bestmile Business Development Director, and Marco Laumans, Bestmile Chief Technology Officer. Luc is a mobility expert and frequent speaker on technology for on-demand driverless and human-driven mobility systems. Marco is an expert in optimization and transportation, has co-authored over 100 scientific articles on the topics, and serves on the executive committee of the Swiss Operations Research Society, as well as the editorial board of Euro Technical Journal on Transportation and Logistics. And believe it or not, they were both born on the same day, but they won't tell you when. So Thanks. Now I will turn it over to Luc. He'll start, and then Marco will share some findings from a technical study we performed, and then we'll go into the Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Bill. Indeed, we are born on the same day. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining. Very happy to see that many of you attending this webinar. Again, we try to keep it short, and please prepare your questions at the end. If we look at the market and the challenges of on-demand mobility services, it's kind of divided into two sections. On one hand, you have, of course, the P2P marketplaces owned by private companies, Uber, Lyft, and others, who don't share any of their technologies with anyone, and of course they don't own the vehicle and they don't support the cost of the assets. Not saying that it's easy, but definitely for them, it's a way to go and a way to grow without having to manage all these assets. But the truth is that professional on-demand mobility service providers usually have to own the fleet, have to support the cost and the investment in the assets. One of our customers, for example, Alto in the US, has developed the whole concept around vehicles developed specifically for them and for the benefits of their customers. And of course, all of this is an added cost on top of all the operations that they have to run on a daily basis. So at the end of the day, and I'm sure you've been following the news recently, the past few months and years, this leads to quite a few failures of these services, in the sense that the margins, not enough margins can be generated. The quality of the service is maybe not there. Yes, of course, there is a shiny mobile app, but at the end of the day, the customer, the client, the traveler wants to be moved properly and efficiently from A to B, and the rest, around, and the cost for the mobility provider is not necessarily his concern whatsoever, which leads to this situation that you see on the screen with different services shutting down one after another, simply because the margins are not there and the quality of the service is not there neither. And that's what we are talking about today. I mean, getting these mobility services right the first time is quite a challenge, as you can see with this gentleman, this funny picture, all the different concerns that basically gravitate around the service that the mobility provider has to address are challenging by definition. What is the fleet efficiency I want to address? When I get into the details of the target time deviation, the excess ride time, all these fancy KPIs that are really important to the success of the service, how can I address them? How can I deploy the service properly? What technology should I get behind the scenes to enable such a service? And as we can see with this gentleman, it's usually, you know, a big question mark. How can I reach those KPIs? How can I increase the service level? And this in the most efficient way, obviously. And what the solution, or not the solution, but the framework that we developed at Bestmile based on many projects and even a response to RFPs, where we were challenged to prove that Bestmile platform was more efficient than other solutions, we have developed what we call the Bestmile service design. So the Bestmile service design is a professional service that is based, first of all, a quick reminder on Bestmile platform. So Bestmile platform, as you all probably know, is an orchestration platform for driverless and human-driven fleets. And it has, you know, different pieces, including applications, of course, a lot of APIs, because customers usually want to own the UX, the UI, and they want to develop their own apps. It has to have multimodal integration with different backend systems. In order to be on time at the train station, at the bus stop, you need to be able to connect with other systems and feed back and forth the different data streams. And of course, we need to integrate with third-party applications like maps, smart city systems, weather forecast, in order to do our job. So quick reminder, the job of Bestmile, it's a cloud software, and our job is to define the A to B and how to get from A to B, basically to send the right vehicle to the right place at the right time. So based on this platform, the beauty of this platform is that it can be used in an environment outside the production system, and that's what we're going to show you in a minute. And also Marco will explain the KPIs that you can get out of this such a service. So now, of course, Bestmile platform in this service design framework is at the center of the service itself. The idea here and the beauty of this platform is to use actually the actual product that will be deployed in production eventually, and to deploy this time in a lab by having a demand model on top and be able to virtualize the vehicles and also to push design parameters into the platform. Then you can run the service the way you want without having any vehicles out there, without disturbing any existing service or disturbing clients and customers. And of course, out of these different iterations that we do for you, and we can accelerate time and so on and so forth, we output a set of KPIs. We have up to 25 KPIs that you can look into. Marco will explain that in details. And again, you can really challenge the system with different design parameters, with different scope, with different objectives, and again, with the actual platform that will be used in production. So it's not a simulation, it's not mathematics, it's not some fancy idea of what the system could be. It's actually the actual platform behind the scenes that will enable your service, your mobility service. And so all these different pieces, the demand model, the virtualized vehicles, the design parameters, the KPIs, and the people actually getting together to make it work, that's what we call the service design. And a key thing is the technology, just for the sake of it, the client doesn't care. What the client is interested in is to be moved properly from A to B and to be on time for a meeting, to be on time at the train station, to be able to get on the bus on time, to get to work, or to bring the kids back back home, and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, this goes down to KPIs. What is the acceptance rate of the platform? It should be at the highest if that's the objective of your mobility service. How can we reduce the usage of the vehicle? Okay, that's a key thing, because it had costs on top of the actual service. So fleet efficiency KPIs are key KPIs to make sure that you can increase the margins using the same vehicles and to provide even more services. Same thing for vehicle related KPIs and so on and so forth. So the methodology is actually quite interesting, because with the service design, we're going to be beside you from the design to the operations. So through these 3 stages, design, deploy, manage, or design, deploy, operate, as you wish, we're going to be using the exact same platform behind the scenes. In fact, the research team at the very beginning on the design phase will ask the development team to provide an instance of Bestmile platform in the cloud, and that's what is going to be used throughout the process until you go into production. And let's not forget that even when you are in production and you are running for a few weeks, a few months, a few years, you can go back to the service design and with actual live data and maybe try to optimize the service again, or maybe you have found some ways to generate more revenue and so on and so forth, but you want to validate that in the lab before you go live. Yes, you can go back to the drawing board, if you will, and run the service design once again or many times again with Bestmile to address maybe this new market or this new service area. With this, I would like to hand over to Marco, and Marco will talk about service design in action in 1 second.
Thank you, Luc. So in the next couple of minutes, I will walk you through how a service design looks like to show you what are the typical results we are getting out of this and what are typical insights. And we are going to do this using the city of Chicago as an example. Chicago is not only, of course, a known and large city, but it's also surprisingly understudied in the literature about on-demand transportation services. But most importantly, this city shares demand data, publicly available data, on which we have based our investigation. So what we did is we did the publicly available taxi data, ingested the data, and took a particular day, March the 1st, 2017, that has about just a bit more than 30,000 rides performed. And of course, take this demand as a basis to run through the platform and to investigate the different parameterization options for the service. Just a few words about the data. So we have ride start and end times at a 15-minute granularity, and the ride start and end locations on the level of census tracts. This is, of course, for privacy reasons. This is how the data was provided, and then from this, we derived concrete demand samples using subsampling both in time and in space. And overall, and then you can see all the data in the white paper and the technical report we provided. We considered 3 exemplary scenarios. One is in and around Lincoln Park. So this is a city neighborhood. There were about 4,500 rides per day. Then an airport shuttle scenario where all rides either start or end at O'Hare Airport. This is, of course, very much beneficial for potential pooling. And finally, the whole demand sample. So the entire 31,000 rides of the day spread around the entire city. Just some statistics. So they have about an 8-minute average direct ride time. And yeah, this is what we are going to focus on now. So if you look at the parameterizations, and as Lucas said, there are a lot of service design parameters we can vary, and one has to choose, and every provider has to choose when going into operations. The results we are going to walk through consider the following subset of parameters. So this is a so-called design space. First of all, sharing. So we consider always the unshared service, so like a normal taxi service, versus a shared, meaning pooling enabled service. Very important parameter is the fleet size, obviously, where we start by 200 vehicles and ramp it up to 480 and see how all the KPIs depend on that and the other parameters. About the booking time, we assumed that 50% of all rides are pre-booked, and if they are pre-booked, they have a mean pre-booking time of 60 minutes. So we chose simply an exponential distribution for the pre-booking time, and the other 50% are then instant bookings. And then finally, on the bottom, you see the 2 different service level specifications. One is a maximum bound on the excess ride time of 50% of the direct ride time plus 2 minutes. and the other one a more relaxed setting of 50% plus 10 minutes. Then PTD means the pickup time deviation. So this would be for instant bookings, the maximum waiting time, or for pre-bookings, the maximum deviation we can allow when scheduling a ride and coming back with the ride proposal to a given ride request of 10 minutes, and that is what we kept constant. So the first KPI we are normally looking into is the acceptance rate. This is kind of the throughput, the maximum throughput you can have in your service as a function of the design parameters. And here, the x-axis is the number of vehicles, so the fleet size. On the left plot, and we are going to keep that same layout in the next couple of slides, the left plot shows the tight rule for the access ride time, which is more, let's say, customer service focused, and the right pane shows the more relaxed setting, which then allows to increase some fleet efficiency KPIs. Color coding is such that the orange line is the non-shared or non-pooled service, and the blue line will be the shared service. Here, what immediately can be seen is that across the board, of course, the pooled service allows to do more with the same fleet size, and you see roughly how the acceptance rate increases as a function of the fleet size. Also, that is quite difficult to reach 100% with a non-shared service, and also that setting the access ride time bound to a more relaxed setting is of course beneficial for the acceptance rate. For instance, you can see that, let's say, if you want to reach, say, 95% service, and we are looking at the right pane, this is achievable with a fleet size of about 270 shared vehicles, whereas in the non-shared service you would need 440 vehicles. Again, this data is, the results are of course dependent on all the assumptions, depending on the demand profile that was used. But the whole point of the service design is to investigate how outputs, how outcomes, KPIs depend on the various input parameters, meaning service design parameters as well as assumptions on the demand. So the benefit of a pooled service of accepting more rides with the same fleet size comes at a cost, obviously, and one of the costs is the excess ride time imposed on the travelers. Here, of course, the orange line, 0 excess ride time for the non-pooled service, and the blue line, just above 3 minutes on average for the tight excess ride time rule, and on the right-hand side, a bit more than 6 minutes for the relaxed rule. Going forward, looking into a little bit more detail how on the vehicle side that translate into actual vehicle movement performed. The orange line here shows that the fleet has to work much more for even a lesser number of rides performed, and it keeps growing. While, and this is an interesting observation, remember that the acceptance rate increases as a function of the fleet size for the shared service. Well, more vehicles are used, but the total movement performed by the vehicles is more or less constant. So one needs more vehicles to have them better spread across the territory, but overall one can do a lot of rides more with a constant vehicle movement distance through better pooling. Yeah, and this then translate, if we divide the vehicle movement done in transportation service, meaning in revenue service, by the total vehicle movement distance, we arrive at the so-called transportation distance ratio KPI. So everything under 100% is deadheading, and we see for the orange line that the values are slightly higher than for traditional taxi service, simply because the fleet is better organized. It shows the value of having an orchestration platform that is optimizing all vehicle movements and allocating the rides simply to the right vehicle across the city. And then in the pool service, especially reach almost 90%, or even on the right-hand side, almost 95%, which means you have only 5% of deadheading for the vehicle fleet. So finally, maybe the last and most interesting KPI is what we call the effective transportation distance ratio, which is the passenger kilometers delivered in terms of direct ride distance divided over the vehicle movement distance. So the value would be passenger kilometers by vehicle kilometers here, the unit. And here, again, the non-pooled service, the value is identical to the ratio we had before, so around 75%. But of course, here we see the benefit of pooling. So on average, we reach a ratio of 2. That means we can deliver 2 kilometers of direct passenger distance for each vehicle kilometer invested. And that finally culminates into investigating what's the fundamental trade-off between fleet efficiency on one hand, so kilometers invested, vehicle kilometers, which translate into the operational cost, versus quality of service to the passenger, here measured in excess ride time. And the plot here is that captures this trade-off in one view. We call it the fundamental diagram of ride sharing, where if you look at the start at the left top corner where we have 0 excess ride time, this is the average vehicle movement distance per ride. Now it's about 6. And then if you slowly start relaxing the excess ride time constraint, you can do more with less vehicles because you pool, but then you impose additional excess ride time on the passengers. And if you keep relaxing that constraint, you can be more efficient, but there's also an effect of marginal return. So there's some sweet spot in the middle where with little bit excess ride time imposed on the passengers, you can gain significantly on the vehicle distance that you have to pay for and as a fleet provider. So with this, just to conclude this quick overview of this study, and again, more details can be found in the technical papers and the white paper. What we see that for across the board, organizing a fleet means to utilize the assets in a better way, regardless whether you do pooling or not. But if you do pooling in addition, the problem to be solved becomes harder. But of course, the fleet efficiency can be increased significantly. In that particular case, it means that a fleet of 400 shared vehicles can serve essentially all the virtually all the ride requests we had for that given day, compared to the more than 2,700 taxis that were used. And again, this is a bit of a difficult comparison because we don't know how the taxis were deployed over the day. And on top of, so this would be a factor of 7 saved in the number of vehicles. If you are satisfied with, let's say, a service level of 95%, then that would translate into a factor of 10 saving just on the number of vehicles. On top of this, you have the savings on the kilometers traveled, so the vehicle movement distance, where again, comparing this data, the 127,000 vehicle transportation distance could be reduced also by about a third. And yeah, so this completes the quick walkthrough. So some of the results, just to really highlight what are the key trade-offs, what are the typical results and insights gained from a service design using a platform that is optimally orchestrating vehicles in real life, using prior to the deployment for any given demand profiles. With that, I'd like to hand over back to Bill for the Q&A sessions.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Luke. A couple of you have already asked about the report and white paper that Luke and Marco referenced, so we'll start with that. These are available on our website at the link below. We will be sending you emails with links to these resources as well. The white paper is kind of a summary of the findings of the study of the Chicago taxi data and the difference between shared and unshared rides and all the KPIs that are managed and balanced. The technical paper, it was really more of a deep dive into the data, how it was extracted, how it was used, how the other literature that has been performed similar studies, comparing those as well. It's a much more detailed and scientific look at and kind of shows how the numbers were crunched and and backs up the claims in more detail. And then looking at the questions, there's a few, first of all, several people have asked, will this webinar be recorded and will we have access to the recording? Yes, it is being recorded, and everyone who is registered, whether you attended today or not, will receive an email with a link to the recorded version. So that you can expect that probably in the next 24 to 48 hours. So now let's get to some of the questions, other questions that have come in. So one person asked, if you don't have a lot of demand data for simulations or access to taxi data for a city, how can you create a reliable service design? It's a good question for Marco.
Yeah, that's a fundamental question, and the answer is well, one can always start with, let's say, even completely random demand, but of course the realism of the results depend very much on the realism of the demand. So looking back into the service designs we have performed already, it's often useful to start with, one can work with something completely random, one can use census data that demand is, let's say, putting some assumptions that it might be proportional to the number of inhabitants per census tract, and then maybe mixed with, especially for destination choice, with the number of working places, number of points of interest, and so on. It's really something, especially the demand data question is where, for instance, we iterate and we work together with our clients to come up with a demand assumption for the given service to be addressed and to be studied.
Okay, another similar question is, how large should a data set be in order to justify service design studies such as the one in Chicago? Did you consider different capacity in terms of number of passengers that the different taxis can carry?
Yeah, so this is again, so the capacity of the vehicle is one of the many design parameters, and one can do a vehicle capacity sizing study in the similar way. One can also look into maybe what's the benefit of having a heterogeneous fleet of vehicles. The sizing, other sizing questions might relate actually to the size of the service area. One thing we found particularly important is that, and that's also not surprising, that there are considerable synergy effects in terms of the demand density over the area. So if you have to cover a large area with few demands, then you need few vehicles, but actually you need quite some still to simply capture the spatial extent. And as the demand intensity grows, there are synergy effects of having a fleet. So we didn't display it here, but let's say if you have double the demand, you do not need double the number of vehicles clearly to serve that demand at a given service level. And so the vehicle sizing, the vehicle capacity question comes into play really when having a substantial demand density. And that relates to the question, is there a benefit of pooling? The benefit of pooling is clearly there, but there is a kind of critical mass in terms of demand density that one needs to make it really worthwhile.
This related question here, someone mentions that in the airline business, they look at RASM, revenue per available seat mile. Is that something you see correlation with that, or that could be adjusted to be a similar KPI?
Yes, so we have not addressed in this study here the question of revenue management. That's a topic on its own. And of course, what we addressed a lot and almost entirely is the cost side of the operation. But if you want to correlate the cost then with the revenue, the upside, and go into revenue management, you could say that, okay, there's a ride request coming in. So what is the marginal cost that my current operational situation has to serve that right request, and compare that to the revenue that you can gain from that right request. And then this opens the door even for dynamic pricing, but these are more advanced questions that that will certainly come down the road, but they need considerable more variables to be included until this is possible to actually capture in operations as well.
Okay, and this is a question about dispatching. Does the vehicle dispatching consider the relocation of empty vehicles? If yes, how does it do that?
So in this study, we have not considered, so we have switched off the vehicle pre-positioning and repositioning, but that's of course something that our platform is also doing, and that's also crucial. And in other studies, we look at questions, what is the value of repositioning, to quantify it, and also to see, of course, that depends on the cost on the deadheading cost. And again, there's also what we are seeing there is also that there's a sweet spot. So too much pre-positioning is also detrimental because it costs simply. But overall, of course, vehicle pre-positioning is important to further increase the efficiency of the fleet.
Okay, so here's a question about, which is, I think, been asked in a few different ways. Is there any difference between service design for human-driven or autonomous vehicles, or are there any limitations on the types of vehicles that can be considered?
No, so the differences are more of the technical nature about technically how to route vehicles, how to dispatch vehicles, how to communicate the UI between the traveler and the vehicle itself, operational aspects such as emergency management in the vehicle and so forth. From a service design standpoint, looking at the parameters we considered here, this is more or less independent on whether there's a human-driven vehicle or a autonomous vehicle. Assuming that, of course, human drivers, if they're employed by mobility service providers, follow, let's say, really the route that is prescribed because traffic is taken into account and so on. And of course, if the routing decisions in the whole system are left to the driver, then in a human-driven service, there's simply more uncertainty the platform has to consider for that particular aspect. But in general, from a service design approach, there's not a significant difference between human-driven and autonomous vehicles.
What about the types of vehicles, say cars versus buses versus shuttles?
Yeah, important vehicle properties, as already discussed and asked in the other question, is the capacity. Mm-hmm. Obviously, buses have higher capacities than vans and than vehicles. The layout of the vehicle might influence what we call the passenger flow time, so the time it needs for passenger to board and alight from a vehicle. And then there's the driving speed of a vehicle, where a bus might be slightly slower. These are, again, parameters that we can consider. But obviously, we couldn't go through all the parameters today. And also, in terms of results analysis, it's important to focus on these parameters that are most important for a given service at hand. But of course, the entire approach is flexible and can handle all these different parameterizations.
Okay, here's a couple of questions I'll try to bundle about kind of how this service is offered. One says, do you offer service design for any reasonably large city? Could Bestmile work with a project in Brazil? What about the size? So in terms of how the service is offered, how can you address that?
Yeah, there's actually no restriction regarding the geography. We are basing, and that's also mentioned here, so typically we work with, based on OpenStreetMap data, then traffic information can be gained from open as well as commercial sources. So in principle, there's no limits to the geography. It is important, again, about the demand model, and as mentioned in the beginning of the Q&A session, that's where typically we work together with our clients to design an appropriate demand model. But in terms of spatial extent, one could also think to not only to do it for a city, but maybe for a whole state or even countrywide. So there's no principle or technical limitations. At the end of the day, it's the calculation, the simulation time, especially if you have a large operation and want to simulate and go over many different parameter combinations. But this can be all parallelized, so also this is just a minor aspect to consider.
Yeah, here's another question that I kind of missed about demand data that might be something that is helpful is, would it be possible, one person asked, to track fleet usage before making recommendations as a way to generate data before doing the service design?
Yeah, that's a little bit how the data was probably derived, that was made public for use by the city of Chicago. So these were actually performed rides. And another way would be to have a vehicle fleet that is already serving certain or providing certain mobility services, to use that and infer what is the underlying demand for that. The tricky part of this is, of course, then the demand is already, it's observed demand versus the underlying raw demand. And of course, there are techniques in transportation science how one can then try to infer what's the underlying fundamental demand when starting from only the observed demand.
So I think we'll start wrapping up here. We got a couple more to get to. One question is, how accurate has service design proven to be with your customers? And what are factors that would cause differences between simulations and actual fleet performance?
Yeah, this is coming back also to what Luc has mentioned about accompanying the entire process from the service design via the actual deployment or the launch through the continual optimization and recalibration in operations. So this is the comparison between the actuals to the, let's say, the service design result is very important. We are doing this also with our clients. And then, of course, there are usually some differences. And one of the key differences is related to the demand, because the demand assumptions might be different. So one can then use the actual observed demand and recalibrate the demand model. Others are also driving times that vary, process times in the system. So by observing an actual operation, one can calibrate better the inputs for the service design as well.
And then maybe we'll wrap up with this one. How long does a service design process typically take? Or is there a typical time frame?
Usually we talk about a few weeks, an iteration from defining the parameters, running the simulations, and generating the results, and then again looking at the results. We are talking about iterations of about 1 to 2 weeks, and usually what is typically done is maybe 2, 3, 4 iterations in a normal process. So we are talking about a month to 2 months overall for this process.
And then in terms of the accuracy, there's another question about have the results been able to be validated?
Yes, this is a similar question we had just before. Yes, the results are, it depends, close to what is observed, and the differences can be explained by the differences in few of the assumptions or of the input data. And if those input data are adjusted to what is actually happening, then they are really close. And that's also a byproduct of this not being so the only thing that is actually simulated is the vehicle movement in the street with observed traffic. So this is on average quite close to what is happening in reality. And then the big simulated piece is the demand, simply. Everything else is the same platform that is also running in operations.
Okay, well, thank you, Marco, for all those answers. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. If we didn't get to your question live, we will contact you via email to make sure that we understand the question and that you get the answer you're looking for. And if you have additional questions that you can also feel free to reach out to us through my email address, which you have on your invitations, or to fill out our contact form on our website. I want to ask you once again to remember to complete the survey you'll get and an email from Zoom. And soon after this closes, and please complete that and give us your feedback. And then one more reminder that you will all get a recording of this webinar within the next 24 to 48 hours. With that, I'll thank you again for attending, and we'll look forward to continuing our conversations in future webinars and coming up. Thank you, and have a good day or evening, depending on where you are in the world. And that will be it for now. Thank you. Bye-bye.